At its peak, Rome controlled everything, from Scotland to Egypt, from Spain to Iraq. 1 in 4 people alive on Earth lived under Roman rule. They built roads that still exist today, aqueducts that carried clean water to millions, laws that form the foundation of every modern legal system, stadiums that held 80,000 people, bridges that crossed rivers nobody else had ever crossed. Rome wasn't just an empire, it was the world. And then it was gone. Not in a single moment, not in a single year, but slowly, painfully, over centuries, the greatest civilization in human history came undone. And the question that has occupied historians for over 1,000 years is deceptively simple. Why? The answer isn't what most people expect, and it has more in common with the world we live in today than most of us are comfortable admitting. Let's go back to the very beginning. Rome started as a tiny settlement on a river, 7 hills, a few thousand farmers, nothing that suggested what was coming. But Romans had one quality that set them apart from almost every civilization before them. They were obsessed with learning from others. When they encountered the Greeks, they didn't simply push them aside. They absorbed their architecture, their philosophy, their art, their gods. When they faced Carthage at sea and had no navy of their own, they captured a single enemy vessel, studied it carefully, built 300 copies, and returned to face their rivals on the water. That is the Roman method. Find what works. Take it. Make it your own. For 5 centuries, this approach made Rome nearly impossible to stop. The Roman army was a level of organized discipline the ancient world had never witnessed. A Roman soldier covered 20 miles each day in full armor and equipment. And when the march ended, instead of resting immediately, he built a fully fortified defensive camp before sleeping. Every single night, regardless of weather, regardless of exhaustion. This was not just an army. It was a system. And systems, when they function properly, are almost unstoppable. Rome expanded until it touched the edges of the known world. Trade flowed along Roman roads from Britain to Persia. Cities rose in places that had been wilderness a generation before. Roman citizenship was eventually extended to people across the entire empire, regardless of where they were born. A farmer from North Africa could become a Roman senator. A soldier from Spain could become an emperor. For a time, Rome was the closest thing the ancient world had to a truly universal civilization. But here is where everything begins to shift. By the 1st century, the empire had grown so vast that governing it from a single city had become almost impossible. A message sent from Rome to a commander on the eastern frontier could take 3 weeks to arrive. By the time a response came back, the situation on the ground had already changed completely. Commanders in distant regions began making their own choices. Governors accumulated their own wealth and their own loyal forces. And gradually, the loyalty that had once flowed upward toward Rome began flowing sideways toward whoever was closest and most powerful. The most dangerous consequence of this was what happened to the position of emperor itself. In the early centuries, the emperor was a figure of immense authority. But as the empire became harder to control, the throne became a prize rather than a responsibility. Between 235 and 284, a period scholars refer to as the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome went through more than 50 different emperors. The majority of them met sudden forced ends at the hands of rivals or their own soldiers. Some held power for only a matter of weeks. The position that was supposed to represent Roman stability had become the most unstable thing in the entire empire. While Roman leaders were focused on overthrowing one another in the capital, the borders were left increasingly exposed. Peoples from beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers began crossing into Roman territory in large numbers. Trade networks that had functioned for generations started to break down. Cities that had grown prosperous over centuries began to shrink. Outbreaks of disease moved through a population that no longer had the infrastructure to respond effectively. The immense system that had held civilization together was beginning to come apart. The Emperor Diocletian eventually brought a degree of stability back, but the solution he chose carried consequences nobody fully anticipated. He divided the empire into 2 halves, An eastern section centered on the wealthy, strategically positioned city of Constantinople, and a western section still anchored by Rome itself. Each half would have its own emperor, its own administration, its own army. On paper, it seemed like a practical response to an unmanageable size problem. In reality, it divided something far more important than territory. It divided Roman identity. The eastern half sat at the crossroads of the most active trade routes in the ancient world. Goods moved through Constantinople from China, from India, from Persia, from across the Mediterranean. The Eastern Empire grew wealthier decade by decade. Its cities expanded. Its institutions remained strong. The western half, by contrast, had fewer natural advantages, longer borders to maintain, and a tax base that was slowly eroding as its population declined and its trade diminished. The East and the West began to feel less like two parts of the same civilization and more like two neighbors who shared a wall but had stopped speaking to each other. Then came the problem that strikes closer to home than most people realize. Rome's obligations were enormous. Maintaining the largest professional military the ancient world had ever seen required constant revenue. Feeding and providing entertainment for the enormous population of the capital, the famous policy of bread and circuses, required constant revenue. Building projects, administrative costs, payments to allied peoples along the borders, all of it required constant revenue. And as the empire became harder to manage, that revenue became harder to collect. The solution Roman authorities reached for was one that governments throughout history have repeatedly returned to. They adjusted the currency. A silver coin that had once been nearly pure silver was gradually mixed with increasing amounts of cheaper metals. More coins could be produced from the same amount of silver. In the short term, this allowed the government to meet its obligations. In the long term, the people who used those coins every day noticed what was happening. Merchants raised their prices to compensate. Soldiers began demanding payment in goods rather than coins they no longer trusted. The confidence that makes any currency function began to erode. By the 3rd century, coins that had once been 90% silver contained barely 2%. The financial foundation of the empire was hollowing out from within. This pattern, spending beyond what can be sustained, adjusting the currency to cover the gap, watching confidence collapse, has appeared in the history of civilizations many times since Rome. It never ends differently. By the time outside peoples arrived at the gates of Rome in 410, the city was a shadow of what it had been at its height. The population had declined from over 1 million to a few 100,000. The Roman military, once the most formidable force on earth, was now composed largely of soldiers recruited from the very peoples Rome had once kept beyond its borders. Commanders and generals came from these outside groups as well. They were professional soldiers, capable fighters, but their primary loyalty was to their paymaster and their own community, not to an abstract ideal of Roman civilization that many of them had never been part of. When outside forces entered Rome in 410, it was less a military triumph than a demonstration of how much the city had already lost. Rome had not been overcome by a superior civilization. It had been undermined by its own internal contradictions, division, financial mismanagement, the erosion of shared identity, and the gradual replacement of civic loyalty with personal interest. The Western Roman Empire formally concluded in 476 when a chieftain named Odoacer informed the last Western emperor, a young man named Romulus Augustulus, that his services were no longer required. There was no final heroic confrontation, no dramatic last defense of the Eternal City, just a quiet, almost anticlimactic conclusion to 1,000 years of history. But the story does not end there, and this final chapter is the one most people never hear. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years. Under the name of the Byzantine Empire, it preserved Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman culture long after the western half had dissolved. Constantinople remained one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on earth well into the medieval period. The empire that the western half had supposedly left behind was still trading, still building, still functioning, while the West entered centuries of fragmentation and decline. What does that tell us? It tells us that geography and resources, while important, were not the deciding factor. The Eastern Empire had advantages, but it also made different choices. It maintained stronger institutions. It preserved a clearer sense of shared purpose. It did not allow the currency to collapse completely. It did not allow internal power struggles to consume its attention while the borders were left exposed. Rome at its greatest was never simply an army or an economy. It was a shared belief. The belief that people from different backgrounds, different languages, different traditions could participate in something larger than any one of them. That they were all, in some meaningful sense, Roman. The moment the belief became too thin to sustain real loyalty, the physical structures of the empire, the roads, the aqueducts, the legions, could not hold it together on their own. Every civilization eventually faces the question that Rome could not answer in time. What are we, beyond our walls and our wealth? What holds us together when things become difficult? Rome's answer, when the moment came, was silence, and silence was all that remained.